So now on to colonialism in regards to Native Americans. And of course, colonialism is really sort of seen through the lens of this idea of a fitter race, let's say. When Europeans arrived on the continent, right, they really put out this idea that they were the fitter race, right, and that because they were fitter, the Native American in a sense had to move aside, right, or bow to what Europeans wanted, and for them, progress they said was essential. Progress was inevitable. So the European mentality was that progress, right, was going to happen, right? So the building of infrastructure, the building of cities. And if you think about most tribal people, they were usually fairly nomadic, right? So this way of life to them was not the ideal way. To them, it was not the way you lived in symbiosis to nature. But there was this idea of almost a socially Darwinistic uh, point put out there, which Darwin would have been appalled, by the way, to have his theories being used in this manner. But social Darwinism argued that, that some people are better than others, right? And their life ways were better, right? So this was very much advanced when Europeans were coming into contact with Native Americans. And then as America as a country, right, starts to be formulated, of course, Americans stood behind the idea of manifest destiny, which was the God-given right to settle from sea to shining sea. And if the Native Americans got in your way, yeah, it's just too bad, right? For instance, in this piece by the famous American artist Albert Bierstadt, who was very well known for doing American landscape works in the mid 1800s to the end of the 1800s, Bierstadt had written in his diaries um, basically this idea that, he hoped a great white city would grow up in this place. So to him, this idyllic Native American group here, with their teepees and their nomadic lifestyle, sort of killing the animals and preparing the skins, right, and the meats and this sort of life on the land. He was like, no, we don't need that, right? We need a great white city to grow up in this place. So that really shows you the attitude, the schism between, the European or American mentality, right, and the Native American mentality. And you see it throughout artworks. This is Thomas Cole, who was a British artist who actually immigrated to America. And he was famous for doing works where you'd have kind of these storms, they were coming through these idyllic landscapes, and often a lone Native American sort of there, right on a cliff, right? But the idea was that their way was dying out, right? Their way was being erased. So the storm was coming, progress was happening, right? And you know, you'd often have these broken tree branches and things from the storm, and it's almost the same mentality of like to make an omelet, you have to break a couple eggs. So again, you can look at these works and really get quite a picture for the American mentality towards the Native Americans and their value. This is Edward Lutz's Westward the Course of Empire Takes Its Way, or its nickname Westward Ho. And this was actually commissioned for the Capitol building in DC. And I always see it as being something that's trying to kind of give a very clear government endorsement to manifest destiny. And it fit into this idea of the sea to shining sea idea. Go west, young man, and grow up with the country. That was a famous quote you'd see in the newspapers of the time, where they were calling upon young men to come help settle the country, put down those train tracks, right? Build those schoolhouses, bring settlers, into the interior of the country. Yeah, it sounds very idyllic, but at the same time, one of the reasons why Go West Young Man started was because there were too many people living in the eastern seaboard cities, like New York City, Philadelphia. They were all overrun. There was too many immigrants coming in from Europe, and really, Go West Young Man was a way to try to spread people out, across the country. It was more functional than anything. But again, it sort of reads as propaganda. And in the piece, you can see you have kind of the wagon train, right, coming. But there's been losses. You'll see there's a little graveyard in the back where the cross is. And then people climbing up onto the rocks, kind of looking out to this golden landscape. And I always say that the group of 3 on the rock, they almost look like kind of an American version of, a Holy Trinity kind of idea of, God the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and then, the woman kinda looks like Virgin Mary holding the Christ child. And he gestures out almost to this idea of the new promised land that America would be for these people. And a lot of colonial art works hard to really demonize Native Americans, right? To make them into something dangerous. And if you look at statements, political statements from the 1800s, you run into this sense that Native Americans were looked at as being disposable, dangerous, and that was sort of the official party line. I mean, you can look at Henry Clay's statement here that Native Americans, their disappearance from the human family would be no great loss to the world. It's pretty blunt. So a lot of artwork, novels of the time, if you've ever read like the Leatherstocking Tales, Fenimore Cooper. A lot of it's about demonizing Native Americans. In this piece by Vanderlyn, this is The Murder of Jane McCrae. It tells the story of a woman who wanted to run off and join with her British loyalist boyfriend. You can actually see him off in the background. If you look really close off in the background of the painting, you can see him back there. He's not going to make it in time to save her. But she's living in the Northeast in the colonies, right? And she wants to run off and join her British loyalist boyfriend. Loyalists, British loyalists, they wanted to stay with the crown. And of course, the American Revolution is what we celebrate as Americans, right? So she wants to run off and meet this guy. We should know right away that she's bad, right? And of course, along the way, she meets up with these two Native Americans who proceed to scalp her. And so I would say this painting actually has kind of a dual meaning. It's like, Native Americans are dangerous. Look out for them. But also it's ladies, you need to think about your priorities, right? Why is she running off with a loyalist, right? She should stay with her family. She should stay with the revolutionists, right? So I also think it's sort of somewhat geared towards telling women what they should do, what's proper behavior for them as well. And I would say these Native Americans, right? They look, burly and over the top and scary, and it's all very contrived, I think, again, to give you a certain message about the Native American. One artist who tried hard to document Native Americans was George Catlin. And he created what he called his Indian Gallery. Because, really up until about 20, 30 years ago, they were called Indians. I remember when I grew up, people still called them Indians. So, but they're not Indians, they're not from India. So Native American is the proper term. But Catlin, he's living in the 1800s. He called this the Indian Gallery. And this gallery coincided with a lot of government actions at this time, like the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which led to the Trail of Tears and the forced movement, right, of Native Americans from the eastern regions into the areas of Oklahoma to be resettled. And that's where reservations come from. It all goes back to the Indian Removal Act. So Catlin, what he did is he went around documenting the life ways of these people. We call these ethnographic images. Ethnography is a sort of a subgrouping within anthropology. Anthropology is the study of people. Ethnography is this idea of life ways, like what kind of clothes do you wear? What kind of customs do you have? What kind of food do you eat? So he went around and he would basically document these tribes. And what we think he was trying to do is preserve what he could of these people before they were, in a sense, exterminated by the progress that American Manifest Destiny basically required. So he went around, kind of trying to uh, keep these people's legacy alive. He recorded 40 tribes, so a good number of tribes, many of which are today actually extinct, right? That no longer exist. But again, a question that people often ask is this faithful representation or artistic idealism? And what do I mean by that? You'll notice that a lot of the pieces I showed you are chiefs wearing regalia or like ceremonies. They're not just like the everyday lives of these people. So we could ask the question, are we seeing the truth of these people? Or are we just seeing kind of an idealistic version of them, right? To me, it's no different than like, seeing somebody's wedding pictures or, high school graduation photos. Those are very calculated photos of a person or a group, right? No one's fighting, everyone looks great, right? Photoshopped makeup. Um, it's not really who we are on a day-to-day basis. So the same thing could be asked here. However, it's important that, the documentation was done. And with Catlin, it's interesting how he even writes about his own work in his diaries. He writes about, kind of, I know these people are going to be extinct, and that's something I can't change, but I'd like to document them. So notice that he wasn't really trying to save them in the real sense. He was trying to save their image. He was a man of his time. He understood what the opinion was on Native Americans. But again, we can be thankful at least that we have his artworks to see some of these tribes, especially the ones that no longer exist. And finally, I want to show you some contemporary artists. And on the right, it's a little academic, the joke, but I love this idea of a lesson in Native values that's taught through very academic, terms, right? That the vanishing Indian paradigm just doesn't fit with his ideas, right? Native Americans like thanks, but I'm gonna reject that. I think a lot of what contemporary Native American artists try to do is they try to reject the vision of the Native American put upon them from the past. And I think they also try to say, look, I'm just trying to speak for myself. I'm not trying to speak for all Native Americans. Like that's impossible. But I'm trying to show you reality. I'm trying to show you something true. So I think they're trying to acknowledge stereotypes in the past, and then they're trying to look to like the future and what's possible. The first artist I want to show you is Edgar Heap of Birds. Now, you'll notice a lot of these artists use their Christian name, right? And also their tribal name at the same time. And that's something else to consider that a lot of the tribes who were placed on the Trail of Tears, one of the things that they didn't want to do is change their names. And that's why they were forced out. A lot of the tribes, especially the ones that were living in Florida or this region at the time, a lot of them agreed to be Christianized so they could stay on their lands. And so one of the things that they did was often assign Christian names to the different people, right? And often very arbitrarily. So today when someone like Heap of Birds uses Heap of Birds, he's kind of trying to say I'm using my native name. I'm using what my people would call me. But he's also saying, but also I have a Christian name Edgar, so I can operate in the world and people understand what my name is. He does a lot of works where he tries to call attention to historic events. He uses a lot of signage. So, what he normally does is kind of create these signs for a very specific site, specific kind of installation, and then people can walk through and look at the signs. So, this was his piece called Building Minnesota that he did pretty early on in his career. And it was meant to honor Native Americans who had been killed ordered killed by the US government for various crimes. And often those crimes, of course, were seen through the lens of the person persecuting the Native American. Today we probably wouldn't consider them crimes. Crimes like trading where a European trader had rights, things like this. Because again, Native Americans didn't really understand the idea of borders or owning land or any of this. They were like, you can't own land. Well, the US government said you could. So he makes these pieces that kind of try to honor these different figures and draw people's attention to perhaps a history that they don't understand. This is a piece that he did dealing with the Trail of Tears. So again, it has this look of almost cautionary signs, like signs you'd see on the side of the road, like no parking, whatever, and uses that format to call your attention to did people choose to walk? Did they choose to go? And make you think about this. And by the way, right above Edgar Heap of Birds, you can actually see his actual Native American name, Hoke Aiwi. So this is actually even his very specific tribal name that he often sometimes also uses in conjunction with his uh, Christianized name combined with, again, the Heap of Birds designation. Uh, these are some later works he's been working on. These are sort of things that he's doing a lot today. Notice that he's very text oriented. He loves to use text. So these are his Dead Indian stories, where he just puts together like different texts saying different things from different reports of people being killed, people being forced along the Trail of Tears, right? For instance, like Indian Killing Post became alcoholic rehab facility. That's addressing how alcohol was introduced to Native Americans by Europeans. And alcohol actually is very deadly in the Native American community. Their rates of alcoholism, based on their biology, are much higher. Their rates of being addicted to alcohol are much higher than Europeans. So this idea of, again, bringing pox, bringing alcohol. So he just writes out these different texts, right? This one always strikes me. Do not dance for pay. So I know we've talked in the class before about, when tourists go to a region, are they really seeing the reality of the people, or are they seeing a display put on for our benefit? And I've said before that, yeah, a lot of it's for your benefit, but if you're truly culturally sensitive, you understand why you're there and what you're trying to gain from it. And also, tourism might be the only way those people make any money. But no, so he's like, no, Native Americans should not do these things. They should not put on tribal rituals for tourists. I went to Alaska a couple years ago, and one of the, a lot of the different shore excursions were like, you could go see like a tribal group dance. And all I could think of was heap of birds telling me, you shouldn't go see these people. You shouldn't pay. You shouldn't dance for pay. I'm like, yeah, but there's people that might be their only economy from tourism. So it's a hard thing to consider. What is the right thing to do in relationship to native values and native traditions? Are you being wrong, right, as a white European descendant, right, going to watch Native Americans dance? So it's tricky. This is one of my favorite projects that he did, Native Hosts, where he puts a name of a place that we would recognize, like California, and writes it backward. And then he says, today your host is Pavunga. So he'd look at like a tribe from that region and say, that's your host for today. I gave you a good video on this. I definitely say watch the video. Because in the video they talk about how is a present tense. They are, they are your hosts. They're not in the past. They exist right now. And so these tribes, he said, are living. I'm trying to keep their legacies alive and have you think about these places that well, who lived there first? What is their claim to that land and that region? And maybe you'll learn a little bit if you go research these tribes and think about their relationship to that place. So I think it's a very educational way that he wants you to consider how you want to interact with this information. And it's very straightforward. He just presents it to you and says, go look a little further. This is Juan Quick to See Smith in her work Trade. She's very famous for doing these works where she kind of takes, I would say, kind of iconic imagery from Native American culture and kind of rethinks it. In this piece, it's a painting on the bottom that has like, ads and different images kind of inlaid within the work. And then, of course, the canoe. And above that, you'll notice that there's this imagery of hanging items related to sports teams who use Native Americans as their mascot. And she kind of says, like, back in the day, we used to trade beads and items, up and down the rivers, right? And today, our likeness is traded, and it's used by white people to, like, sell things or, promote a sports team. And, Florida, TCC, FSU, the Seminoles. This probably strikes pretty close to home when we think about the idea of the Seminole as a sports icon, right? And she's like, yeah, so today people trade on the past of my people. That's what they trade on. She's done maps where she will overlay the maps with the iconography or the imagery of the tribes that used to live in the region. She's done maps where she'll only use the native names for a place. So if, a state, that region used to have a native name, she'll write the native name there instead of like, the name we use now. And again, I think she tries to kind of whip up this interesting approach to, the past, the present, the future. And there's a little bit of comedy in it, a little bit of kind of twisting something and making you try to laugh a bit, but then in the laughter kind of make you go, oh, wait a minute, you know, maybe I need to think about why I use this kind of imagery. Like, why do I think, the Seminole is okay? You know, though I will say in defense for FSU, right, they do a lot for the Seminole community. They give scholarships to the community, etc. So they've tried to create a relationship where they're trying to support that community. And the Seminoles like the money they get from FSU licensing their imagery. Every couple years, NAACP or the ACLU or somebody tries to bring suit against FSU, and the Seminole tribe's always like, "No, no, we're good, thanks. We like the money we get from this arrangement. Don't worry about us." The final artist is Fedorov that you see here, and I gave you a video of his office shaman project, so make sure to go watch that. And then he also did a whole group of things called the Totem Teddies, um, where he thought about this idea of totems, right, and totemic objects and sacred objects within Native rituals. And he says, "What if I kind of almost make them like their consumer objects that can be branded and sold like they're like Beanie Babies, right, or some kind of stuffed animal? How can I commodify perhaps the things from my tribe?" So he's kind of thinking in my mind about commodification and consumerism, the American workplace, and can you fit native lore and native thought into those parameters?